Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and all 3,000 followers from around the world. My mother told me when I was still very young that whenever I have to speak to an audience that I should not have more than 5 messages. So today I have 3. If I go to 4, stop me. The first message I wanted to share with you is that every year, the UN Environment Programme issues what we call the emissions gap report, which basically tries to measure the gap on emissions. We are here in a climate change setting. And the 2016 emissions gap report was issued on 3rd of November, and it argues that despite the Paris Agreement and despite the INDCs, we still have a gap of 12 to 14 gigatons. So we are still in a trajectory of 2.9 to 3.2 degrees Celsius. So we are still very far from the 2-degree agreement in Paris. Now, to give you some perspective, 1 gigaton is the equivalent of the use of all cars in the EU for 12 months. So you take out of the road all the cars in the EU. Over a 12-month period, you will save 1 gigaton. The gap is right now between 12 and 14. But the report also shows that it is actually possible to reduce that gap by some measures, including energy efficiency, transport, and industry. But we also know that landscape restoration, be it terrestrial landscapes or seascapes restoration, can contribute greatly to reducing that gap. And I would like to focus my attention today on that last part. Second message is that the UN Environment Programme has been working over the last 2.5 years into what we call the inquiry into the financing of sustainable development. In other words, since the Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted by world leaders, the big question is, how do we get the financing to that? And when we say financing, I'm not only referring to public financing, but actually to private financing and how the markets could actually influence the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because we know that public financing is just a fraction of what is needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Governments have a very important role to play in removing barriers and in creating the conditions for private sector investments in order to shift from a fossil fuel development pattern to a sustainable development pattern. But we also know that governments cannot actually provide the financing that is needed. The financing coming from government is actually collected from taxes, and these taxes are generated from businesses, including businesses run by companies all over the world. How, therefore, can we shift the interests of the private sector from a sort of exploitation to a management of landscape? How can we achieve the ambitions of feeding the 9 billion people, of actually living sustainably in this world without further deteriorating degrading the environment, without further depleting forests and landscapes? So in other words, investments that are needed for agriculture and for other activities will have to be done in a way that would not be in contradiction with our ambition to conserve our forests and to restore our landscapes. In the jargon of our colleagues in the UN, they call it decoupling. So you can actually have your cake and eat it. The third message is that actually there are very good examples already in the world in order to achieve just that. And one of these examples actually is coming from Indonesia. I'm very happy to see Pak Kuntoro here, my dear friend, because the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility that has just been established in Jakarta and that I'm sure he will be speaking about is one of these such great examples. I'm also very happy to see my friend Jost here, whom I met many years ago, and who for the first time talked to me about what he does in terms of sustainable trade initiative. So there are very good examples that are out there in the world. The private sector is actually understanding clearly what we need to do. Governments will have to provide facilities and to remove the barriers that are still there in order for the private sector to be able to shift from the old tradition to the new tradition. So it is possible to achieve concretely the Sustainable Development Goals. It is possible to restore landscapes, and I'm very happy to know that over 120 million hectares have been pledged already as part of the Bond Challenge, and I understand that maybe by 2020 we can get to the $150 million. So that is a great achievement. So by keeping forests, in other words, shifting from the traditional agriculture that is degrading environment to an agriculture that is more sustainable and that will be having less impact on the environment on one hand, and in restoring ecosystems on the other hand, I think we can achieve greatly in terms of global landscapes. We can achieve greatly in terms of sustainable development goals, but more importantly, we can achieve our ambitions on climate without degrading our environment any further. I will thank you very much for that.